Her ex-husband mocked her in court, but when the judge saw the documents, his face turned pale. The courtroom was cold and sterile, its wooden benches filled with quiet murmurs from scattered spectators. A woman sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Despite her composed exterior, her stomach churned. Across from her, her ex-husband lounged arrogantly in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. He was dressed in an expensive suit, the kind that screamed wealth and power, as if he had already won before the judge had even entered the room. His attorney sat beside him, flipping through documents with an air of disinterest, as if this was merely a formality. She had spent the last year preparing for this day, yet the weight of it still pressed down on her like a boulder. The divorce proceedings had been brutal. Her ex-husband had contested everything: assets, finances, even personal belongings, dragging the case out longer than necessary. He had always been that way, unwilling to let go of control, determined to prove that she was nothing without him. Now, he was here to make sure she left with nothing. The doors at the back of the room opened, and the judge entered. The murmurs died instantly as everyone rose. The woman inhaled deeply, steadying herself. The judge, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, settled into his chair, adjusting his glasses as he glanced at the case file in front of him. He looked at both parties before clearing his throat. "Let's proceed." Her ex-husband's lawyer stood first, his voice smooth and practiced. "Your Honor, my client has provided ample evidence that he was the sole provider in this marriage. He built his career from the ground up while the plaintiff contributed nothing financially. We seek a ruling that grants her no spousal support and minimal asset division." Her ex-husband crossed his arms, his smirk widening. He turned toward her, his voice dripping with mockery. "I hope you didn't come here expecting a handout." A few chuckles rippled through the audience. She clenched her jaw, but said nothing. The game was just beginning. The woman remained still, her expression unreadable, while the judge glanced at her attorney. "Do you have anything to present in response?" Her lawyer, a composed woman with years of experience, stood and adjusted her suit. "Your Honor, we dispute the claim that my client contributed nothing. While she may not have had a formal income, she played a significant role in supporting her husband's success. We request a full financial review before any decisions are made." Her ex-husband let out a low chuckle. "Supporting my success? What a joke." He turned to the courtroom, spreading his arms as if addressing an audience. "She spent years doing nothing while I worked tirelessly. Now she wants a piece of my empire? Please." His words dripped with amusement, and a few people in the gallery whispered among themselves. She tightened her grip on her lap, feeling the heat of humiliation rise in her cheeks. He wanted her to break, to react, to lash out in desperation. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Not yet. Memories flooded her mind, the years she had spent at his side when he was nothing more than an ambitious dreamer. She had worked endless hours behind the scenes, handling finances, managing schedules, making sacrifices that had gone unnoticed. He had leaned on her in ways he would never admit now, back when he was struggling to keep his business from collapsing. She recalled the nights she spent poring over financial statements, making calls to negotiate debts, working tirelessly to ensure that his dream survived. She had sold her own belongings, dipped into her personal savings, and sacrificed her career opportunities so that he could have his. And now, sitting in this courtroom, he had the audacity to act as if she had been a mere spectator in his success. Her lawyer glanced at her before stepping forward. "Your Honor, if I may request a short recess before we continue?" The judge nodded, allowing them a brief break. The woman rose from her seat and walked outside to clear her mind. As she stood in the hallway, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "You should just give up," her ex-husband said smugly, approaching her with his hands in his pockets. "You're embarrassing yourself." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "You'll walk out of here with nothing, just like you deserve." She exhaled slowly, turning to face him. There was no anger in her eyes, only something far more unsettling: confidence. "We'll see about that," she said calmly before walking back into the courtroom. As the trial resumed, her ex-husband's lawyer continued pressing his argument. "My client has already been generous in allowing the plaintiff to keep a few personal assets. Given her lack of contribution, we see no reason for further financial support." Her ex-husband folded his arms, shaking his head in mock pity. "It's honestly sad," he mused aloud. "Some people just don't know when to let go." He turned toward her, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You always wanted to ride my coattails, didn't you?" A few gasps echoed in the room, but she remained composed. The judge, however, frowned. "Mr. Sullivan, I suggest you keep your comments professional." The woman simply reached into her bag, pulling out a folder. Her ex-husband's smirk faltered slightly as he watched her hand it to her lawyer. The moment she had been waiting for was finally here. The judge took the folder and adjusted his glasses as he flipped through the contents. His initial look of boredom faded, replaced by something more serious. He read in silence for a moment, and as he turned each page, his brow furrowed deeper. Her ex-husband shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his lawyer. "What's that?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The judge finally looked up. "These are financial statements, loan records, and business contracts from the early years of your company. They indicate that the plaintiff made significant monetary contributions, covering debts and funding initial operations." The color drained from her ex-husband's face. That's ridiculous." "She didn't." The judge silenced him with a stern look. "Is this information accurate?" The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with tension. The tide was turning, and for the first time, her ex-husband realized he was no longer in control. The woman sat motionless as the courtroom buzzed with whispers. The judge continued flipping through the documents, his face growing increasingly serious. Her ex-husband, who had spent the entire trial lounging with confidence, now sat rigid in his chair. His eyes darted between the judge and his attorney, seeking reassurance, but none came. His lawyer hesitated before leaning in, whispering something in hushed urgency. The woman caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes, a rare sight, considering his usual arrogance. Instead of responding to his growing panic, she remained silent, letting the weight of the evidence settle over the room. She had been waiting for this moment for months, meticulously gathering proof of her contributions, tracing every payment she had made, every sacrifice she had endured. Her ex-husband had built his success on the foundation she had laid, and now, for the first time, he was being forced to acknowledge it. Still, she knew better than to celebrate prematurely. The courtroom was a battlefield, and the real fight was just beginning. The judge turned his attention to her attorney. "Where did you obtain these records?" he asked, his voice devoid of the indifference he had shown earlier. The lawyer stood confidently. "Your Honor, these records were retrieved from financial archives and legal transactions made under my client's name. They verify that she personally invested in the early stages of her husband's company, covering costs that allowed it to stay afloat." The judge nodded, flipping to another page. "Interesting." Her ex-husband's face twisted in disbelief. "This is absurd. She didn't, these are fake. There's no way she had that kind of money." His outburst earned a sharp glance from the judge. "Mr. Sullivan, control yourself. We'll determine the authenticity of these records through legal verification." He turned back to the woman. "Do you have anything further to add?" She met his gaze evenly before speaking for the first time since handing over the documents. "Yes, Your Honor," she said calmly. "I'd like to call a witness." Her ex-husband stiffened. "Witness?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying the confidence he had so carefully constructed. The woman nodded toward the back of the courtroom. The doors opened, and a middle-aged man in a tailored suit entered. He walked with purpose, nodding toward the judge before taking his place at the witness stand. The woman remained poised, watching as her ex-husband's face darkened. The judge gestured toward the witness. "Please state your name and relation to this case." The man adjusted his tie before speaking. "My name is Alan Green. I'm a financial consultant and was an external auditor for Sullivan Enterprises during its early years." A murmur ran through the room. Her ex-husband clenched his jaw, gripping the arms of his chair as if bracing for impact. "And what is your testimony today, Mr. Green?" the judge continued. The man glanced at the woman before turning back. "I'm here to confirm that the plaintiff was, in fact, a major financial supporter of her husband's company. Without her contributions, it wouldn't have survived its first 3 years." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The woman remained composed, watching her ex-husband's reaction. His hands had tightened into fists, his lips pressed into a thin line. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Green, can you provide specific details?" The witness nodded, flipping through a folder he had brought with him. In the early years, the company faced multiple financial crises. Investors pulled out, banks denied loans, and bankruptcy was a looming threat. During this time, the plaintiff personally covered payroll, paid off equipment leases, and secured private funding under her name to keep operations running. Her ex-husband shook his head rapidly. "No. This isn't right." His lawyer put a hand on his arm, signaling for him to remain quiet, but he was unraveling. "She didn't give me anything. I built this company on my own." The judge raised a hand to silence him. "Mr. Sullivan, you will have your chance to respond. For now, let the witness speak." The woman remained quiet, allowing the moment to unfold. She had no interest in arguing with a man who had spent years taking her for granted. The truth spoke louder than his denial ever could. Her ex-husband's composure had completely crumbled. He shook his head, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair as if trying to process what was happening. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. My wife was just a housewife, she didn't have access to that kind of money." He turned to the witness. "You're lying. You have to be." Mr. Green remained unshaken. "I have bank transfers, signed agreements, and financial statements to prove my claim." He handed a thick stack of documents to the judge, who took them with growing interest. The judge flipped through the new set of evidence, occasionally glancing up at her ex-husband, who was now visibly sweating. The room felt charged, the power dynamic shifting. The woman stayed silent, her expression unreadable. Every financial transaction, every loan she had taken out, every sacrifice she had made was now on full display. For years, he had told her she was insignificant, that she had done nothing. And now, The very foundation of his wealth was being linked directly to her. The truth was finally catching up to him. The judge took his time reviewing the evidence, the air thick with tension. After a few minutes, he set the papers down and turned to her ex-husband. "Mr. Sullivan, can you explain these transactions?" Her ex-husband's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked to his lawyer for help, but the man sat stiffly, his confidence shaken. He had likely believed his client's claims without expecting such damning evidence to surface. Her ex-husband shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I don't recall any of this," he muttered. His voice lacked the arrogance it held earlier. The woman watched as he struggled to form a coherent response, knowing that his world was beginning to crumble. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain why multiple payments toward your company's debts originated from your wife's personal account," the judge continued. "Or why she was listed as a guarantor on your initial business loan." His ex-husband's face was pale, and for the first time, he had no clever remark to offer. The lawyer representing her ex-husband cleared his throat, sensing the damage. "Your Honor, I believe my client was unaware of these contributions." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Unaware? Are you suggesting he unknowingly benefited from his wife's financial sacrifices for years?" The room fell silent. The woman's ex-husband squirmed in his seat. I didn't ask for her help," he finally blurted out. The judge let out a heavy sigh. "Yet you accepted it," he said firmly. The words hung in the air like a final verdict. The woman remained still, watching her ex-husband with unreadable eyes. She had no interest in revenge, only justice. For years, he had treated her like an accessory to his success, dismissing her sacrifices as insignificant. Now, he was being forced to face the truth, and there was no escaping it. This was only the beginning of his reckoning. The judge let out a slow exhale as he tapped his fingers against the thick pile of financial records before him. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. He looked up at her ex-husband, his gaze sharp and expectant. "Mr. Sullivan, do you deny that these transactions occurred?" The man shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar as though the room had suddenly grown unbearably hot. I don't remember," he stammered. "She must have done this behind my back. I never asked her to." His lawyer winced slightly, as if already sensing the futility of the argument. The judge's expression darkened. "Yet you benefited from it," he said firmly, echoing his previous statement. "And given the amounts involved, it's highly unlikely you had no knowledge of where this money was coming from." He turned his attention back to the woman, who remained composed. "I'd like to hear from the plaintiff. Can you confirm these financial contributions were made knowingly and willingly?" She nodded once, her voice clear. "Every cent, Your Honor. I gave everything I had to ensure my husband's success. I never expected repayment, only respect. Instead, I was discarded the moment he no longer needed me." The judge's gaze lingered on her for a moment before turning back to Mr. Green, the financial consultant. "In your professional assessment, what would have happened to Sullivan Enterprises if these funds had not been provided?" Mr. Green didn't hesitate. The company would have folded within its first 2 years. It was in severe financial distress, with no viable investors willing to take the risk. Without the plaintiff's financial support, bankruptcy would have been inevitable. A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom. Her ex-husband's face had drained of color, his fingers clenching and unclenching in frustration. Her ex-husband let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "So what? She helped a little in the beginning. That doesn't mean she's entitled to half of everything I built." His voice, once brimming with arrogance, now carried an edge of desperation. "I was the one who put in the work. I was the one making the deals, staying up all night managing the business. She just sat at home." The judge raised a hand, silencing him once more. "Mr. Sullivan, whether or not you believe her contributions were significant, the law does not dismiss financial backing as meaningless. Without her, there would have been nothing to build." For the first time since the trial began, her ex-husband looked genuinely lost. He turned to his lawyer, his lips pressing into a tight line. His attorney, previously confident, now seemed hesitant, flipping through documents as if searching for a counterargument that simply didn't exist. The weight of the courtroom's collective judgment bore down on him, and for once, he had nothing clever to say. The woman, on the other hand, remained still, her hands folded on the table. She had spent years enduring his dismissive attitude, his belittling comments, his arrogance. Today, all of it was unraveling. The judge cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension. "Given this new information, I will need to reassess the division of assets. It is clear that the plaintiff's contributions were substantial and cannot be dismissed." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Her ex-husband's head snapped toward the judge, his eyes wide with panic. "Reassess? You can't be serious. This is my company. My money." His voice had lost all its former confidence, replaced with something that almost resembled fear. The judge fixed him with a firm look. "Your success was not built alone, Mr. Sullivan. And today, that truth has finally come to light." The once smug man now looked like a cornered animal. His hands curled into fists as he leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something urgently. The attorney's expression remained unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. There was nothing left to argue. The woman observed it all in silence, watching as the reality of the situation slowly sank in for her ex-husband. He had believed himself untouchable, certain that he could walk away without consequence. But now, the same courtroom he had entered with laughter and mockery was watching him unravel. "I want a private negotiation," he hissed suddenly, directing his words toward the judge. His voice was lower now, stripped of its bravado. "This doesn't need to go further. We can settle this." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Now you want to negotiate?" His ex-husband swallowed hard, forcing a tight smile. "I'm just saying, we don't need to drag this out in front of everyone. She's already embarrassed me enough." The woman's attorney spoke before she could. "My client has no interest in settling privately. She has every right to have this handled in court." The woman remained silent, but the slight upturn of her lips spoke volumes. Her ex-husband turned back to his lawyer, his patience clearly unraveling. "Say something," he demanded. His lawyer sighed, rubbing his temples before finally addressing the judge. "Your Honor, given the overwhelming evidence presented today, I believe it is in my client's best interest to consider a fair division of assets." His ex-husband's head snapped toward him, his face contorted with disbelief. "You're supposed to be on my side," he seethed. His lawyer's voice remained level. "My job is to provide legal counsel, not to argue against facts. If we push this further, you stand to lose much more." For the first time since the proceedings began, her ex-husband was completely speechless. He had spent the entire trial believing himself untouchable, convinced that his version of events would be accepted without question. But now, even his own lawyer was acknowledging the inevitable. The woman finally spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "You spent years telling me I was nothing without you. That I was lucky to be in your shadow. But now, here we are." She tilted her head slightly, watching as his composure crumbled. "Seems like you were the lucky one after all." The judge turned back to the woman. "Your financial documents show that you personally funded the initial years of the company. However, there are additional accounts listed under your name. Are you aware of these?" Her ex-husband frowned, his frustration momentarily replaced by confusion. "What accounts?" The woman took a slow breath before answering. "I made investments of my own," she said evenly. "Since I was handling most of the company's financials in the early years, I knew where to place smart investments. While you were focused on growing the company, I was ensuring my own financial security." The judge flipped through another set of papers. "And according to these statements, those investments have flourished significantly." He looked up. "In fact, your personal net worth is substantial, independent of your husband's company." The room fell silent. Her ex-husband's mouth opened slightly, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "That's not possible," he muttered. "You never had any money of your own." The woman finally let out a small, humorless laugh. "That's what you thought," she said, meeting his gaze. "But you were too busy underestimating me to notice." Her ex-husband's breathing grew uneven as he processed the revelation. The idea that she had secured her own wealth while he had dismissed her as nothing was more than his pride could handle. His hands clenched into fists as he leaned forward. "You're lying," he hissed, his voice shaking. "You couldn't have done this without me. You don't have the skills, the connections." He cut himself off, realizing too late that every word only deepened his humiliation. The woman remained calm, watching his unraveling with quiet satisfaction. The judge flipped through the investment records, nodding as he examined the figures. "According to these statements, the plaintiff's personal portfolio has grown exponentially over the years," he confirmed. "If anything, it appears she is in a stronger financial position than Mr. Sullivan." A ripple of whispers ran through the courtroom. Her ex-husband's face turned red with anger and disbelief. "No," he muttered under his breath. "That's impossible." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of rage and desperation. "You were supposed to be nothing without me." For years, he had carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed he was untouchable. Now, stripped of his self-imposed superiority, he looked smaller, like a man realizing, for the first time, that he was not as powerful as he had always imagined. His once proud posture was slumped, his jaw tight with frustration. His lawyer, no longer able to defend him, sat stiffly, flipping through documents as though searching for an escape that didn't exist. The woman merely observed, saying nothing. There was no need to gloat, the truth had already done all the work for her. The judge sighed, closing the file and adjusting his glasses. "Given the overwhelming evidence, I will be reassessing asset division," he announced. The plaintiff's financial contributions were critical to the establishment of Sullivan Enterprises, and her investments indicate a level of financial independence that cannot be ignored. Her ex-husband's head snapped up, panic flickering in his eyes. "Wait, what does that mean?" he demanded. The judge's expression remained impassive. "It means, Mr. Sullivan, that your claims regarding financial superiority hold little weight in this case. In fact, they may work against you." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Her ex-husband sat frozen, his mind racing to process what was happening. The confidence he had walked into the courtroom with had vanished entirely. The judge adjusted his papers, his voice calm but firm. After reviewing all evidence, it is clear that the plaintiff was instrumental in ensuring the financial survival of Sullivan Enterprises. As such, she is entitled to a fair division of the assets, including compensation for her financial and personal sacrifices. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Her ex-husband shook his head rapidly. "No," he muttered. "This isn't happening." But it was. His lawyer remained silent, clearly unwilling to fight a losing battle. The judge continued. "Furthermore, given the plaintiff's independent financial standing, she will have full discretion over her share of the settlement. Mr. Sullivan will not be entitled to any of her personal investments or assets." Her ex-husband visibly flinched. The idea that she was leaving this marriage not only with what she had rightfully earned but also with more security than he had anticipated was more than he could stomach. The woman, meanwhile, remained composed. She had fought too hard to let emotions rule her now. The courtroom was still, waiting for his reaction. For a moment, her ex-husband sat in silence, his breathing heavy. Then, as though unable to contain himself, he slammed his fist against the table. "This is absurd," he roared, rising to his feet. "I built this company. I put in the work. She did nothing but sit at home and pretend to be important." His face was red, his voice shaking with fury. The judge, unfazed, simply gestured to the bailiff, who took a step forward as a silent warning. "Mr. Sullivan, I suggest you control yourself," the judge said coldly. Her ex-husband inhaled sharply, his hands trembling at his sides. The realization was setting in, he had lost. Not just the trial, but the narrative he had spent years creating. He had told himself she was weak, dependent, insignificant. But in the end, she had proven to be the one holding the power. She hadn't needed to argue, to yell, to beg for fairness. She had simply presented the truth, and it had done all the work for her. He had spent years underestimating her, and now, it was that arrogance that had destroyed him. The judge finalized his ruling, ensuring that her financial contributions would be recognized and compensated. He granted her a substantial portion of the assets, securing her future without any ties to her ex-husband. The ruling was met with quiet murmurs from those in attendance, but the woman paid them no mind. Her ex-husband, on the other hand, looked as though the ground had been ripped from beneath him. He stood stiffly, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. His lawyer didn't bother to console him, there was nothing left to say. The woman slowly rose from her seat, gathering her documents. For the first time in years, she felt light. She turned toward her ex-husband, meeting his furious gaze with an expression of quiet triumph. There was no need for words, he understood exactly what had happened. She had walked in as the woman he had once belittled, mocked, and dismissed. And now, she was walking out with everything he had sworn she would never have: justice, dignity, and freedom. With a final nod to the judge, she turned and walked toward the courtroom doors, leaving her ex-husband behind. As she stepped out into the hallway, the murmurs of those who had witnessed the trial followed her. Some whispered in shock, others in admiration. "Did you see his face?" someone murmured. "He really thought he was untouchable." Another voice responded, "She played the long game. And she won." The woman ignored the hushed conversations around her. This moment wasn't about them. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about reclaiming what had been taken from her, her agency, her value, her own sense of worth. She walked with quiet confidence, the weight of the past finally slipping from her shoulders. The fight had been exhausting, but it had been worth it. For too long, she had lived under the shadow of a man who believed he was above her. Now, she was stepping into a life where she owed him nothing. No more compromises, no more sacrifices for someone who had never appreciated them. She had fought for herself, and for the first time in a long time, she had won. Stepping outside the courthouse, the woman inhaled deeply, letting the cool air fill her lungs. For the first time in years, she felt free. No more walking on eggshells, no more wondering when the next condescending remark would come. The weight of years spent in a marriage that drained her had finally lifted. She had entered this trial as the woman he had belittled, dismissed as worthless, but she was walking out as someone stronger, someone who had reclaimed her identity. It was a victory far greater than any financial settlement. This was about proving to herself that she was never as powerless as he made her believe. Her ex-husband, on the other hand, remained inside the courtroom, likely still reeling from the verdict. He had spent years crafting a false narrative where he was the self-made man and she was just an accessory. Now, the world knew the truth. She had been the backbone of his success, the silent force that had kept him afloat. And in the end, it wasn't his wealth or his arrogance that won, it was her patience, her intelligence, her quiet resilience. She walked toward her car, each step feeling lighter than the last, leaving behind not just the courthouse, but the past that had once held her captive. Days passed, and she settled into the quiet satisfaction of her new life. She no longer felt the need to check her phone, dreading another passive-aggressive message from her ex-husband. The legal battles were over, the chapter closed. Yet, one evening, as she sat on her balcony sipping tea, her phone buzzed with an unexpected notification, a message from him. She stared at the screen, debating whether to open it. Curiosity won, and she tapped the message, her eyes scanning the words carefully. "I didn't expect things to turn out like this," it read. "I was wrong about a lot of things." She let out a slow breath, rereading the message. There was no grand apology, no true acknowledgement of all the harm he had caused, but it was something. A crack in the ego that had once seemed impenetrable. She thought about responding, but then, what would be the point? She had no need for his apologies, no desire to rekindle any form of connection. His regret belonged to him, and whatever he felt now was his burden to bear. She deleted the message without a second thought, returning to her tea. The past no longer had a hold on her. The weeks that followed were filled with new beginnings. With the settlement she had rightfully earned, she invested in herself for the first time in years. She reopened the business she had once sacrificed for her marriage, a dream she had buried in favor of his ambitions. This time, there was no one telling her what she could or couldn't do. No dismissive sighs, no belittling words disguised as advice. It was her vision, her work, her success. And the best part? She didn't need anyone's approval to validate it. She worked tirelessly, but it was different now. It wasn't exhaustion from being unappreciated, it was fulfillment, the kind that came from knowing that every effort was for her own future. Clients respected her, her business grew, and for the first time in a long time, she looked in the mirror and recognized herself. She had spent years building someone else's dream, believing she had no choice. Now, she was building her own, and the satisfaction of that was greater than any courtroom victory. Word of her success spread quickly, reaching even those who had once doubted her. Former acquaintances who had sided with her ex-husband now spoke of her with admiration, though she paid little mind to their delayed recognition. She had no interest in proving anything to those who had turned their backs when she needed them most. The only thing that mattered was the lesson she had learned. She was never as weak as they made her believe. The power had always been hers, she had just needed to reclaim it. Her story resonated with many, especially those who had been in similar situations, partners who had sacrificed for ungrateful spouses, people who had been told they were nothing without someone else. And as much as she had once wished for revenge, she realized now that her greatest triumph wasn't watching her ex-husband's downfall. It was rising above him. He had built his life on tearing her down, but she had built hers on strength, resilience, and dignity. And that was something he could never take from her. One afternoon, she found herself walking through the city, passing by a familiar building, Sullivan Enterprises. The company that she had once helped save, the empire that had nearly crushed her. Through the glass windows, she could see her ex-husband pacing inside his office, his expression tense. His name was still on the building, but he was no longer untouchable. His public image had taken a hit, investors had lost confidence, and the cracks in his empire were beginning to show. His arrogance had been his undoing, and now, he was left to face the consequences. She didn't linger. There was nothing for her there. She had spent years believing that his success defined her worth, but now she understood she was never dependent on him. If anything, it had been the other way around. He had needed her to prop him up, to believe in him when no one else did. And now, without her, he was faltering. She turned away, walking past the building without a second glance. Her future was ahead of her, and she had no interest in looking back. Sitting by her window that evening, she reflected on everything she had been through. The years of sacrifice, the heartbreak, the trial that had tested her resilience, it had all led her to this moment. A life where she was free, independent, and in control of her own destiny. She no longer carried the weight of regret, nor did she feel bitterness toward the past. She had won, not because she had taken something from her ex-husband, but because she had taken herself back. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the city, she smiled to herself. This was just the beginning. The world was open to her now, full of possibilities she had once thought impossible. And for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. She had fought for herself and had emerged stronger than ever. There was no need for revenge, no need to dwell on the past. Because the best revenge, the greatest triumph, was simply this, living well, on her own terms, without him.